All right, so the final installment for now in our discussion of Saint Alamotar. So, to summarize, what we've seen until now is that Chazal instituted a specific time to request for rain in Eretz Yisrael. He also instituted a specific time to request for rain in Bavel. There then became a big dispute as to whether or not the times for Bavel are to be applied to all places outside of the land of Israel, or are they specific to Bavel, and each other place should do in accordance with their needs of their specific region, country, etc. We saw that the Rosh very strongly believed that it is appropriate to daven for rain based on your local needs. And he even cites other great rabbis who, at least in theory, agreed with him. But in practice, he was not able to pull through, he was not able to implement his opinion. And so he himself concedes that it's more important to be davening the same as everybody else and to be davening what makes sense, which is in and of itself a very powerful message. And, of course, a controversial one. And so the halacha remains that the rest of the world all does like Bavel, and that's how it is. The opinion of the Rosh still carries halachic practical weight in that if somebody accidentally says V'sein Talamotar at a time when they're, which is out of the season of Bavel, but it's a time that their specific country is good for them to have rain, so then you do not need to repeat the Amidah. Another important...
It's probably unlikely, right, for somebody to make that mistake.
Why?
Because you're saying the other thing, and it hasn't been, the community.
What do you mean after Pesach? You're in again, last week we said it's a little bit hesitant to exactly figure out the dates, but after Pesach you have to switch to stop saying the same Talamotar. And you still have a Saint Alamotar on your tongue. So if you're in a place where that's okay,
where there's still
if you're in Toledo, Spain, right? That's what the Rosh is talking about. Right?
I'll say that.
I believe that most places are like that. Again, the ins and outs of it we discussed last week. I'm not going to review all that now. Another important point that the Rosh made that we need to focus on is also that there's really two or three things at discussion of here. One thing is when do you start saying the same Talamotar, meaning, and the other is when do you not say it, right? So when's the starting point, when's the finishing point, and we'll see that that's going to become very relevant in today's conversation. And really there's a third thing of whatever you do with the requesting for rain, how do you match up the mentioning of Mashiv HaRuach or Merid HaGeshem before that? So that's the third part of the whole puzzle. Now, until now, all we've discussed is the northern hemisphere. We've spoken about Israel, we've spoken about Bavel, Iraq, we've spoken about Europe, United States, etc. What about the southern hemisphere? Southern hemisphere, summers, winters, winter, summer, as we would say it, right? In other words, more or less, if we call from Sukkot to Pesach winter time and from Pesach to Sukkot summertime, there it's the opposite way around. And nowadays there are many Jewish communities in the southern hemisphere. You have Brazil, you have Argentina, you have South Africa, you have Australia, Uruguay. And so what should they all be doing? So the first time that there's a record of this discussion is in Shilas Utshuvas Teres Chaim, written by the Rabbi of Salonika, Greece, in the... he lived from, his dates are 1550 to 1647. I'm not sure if we have a date specifically for this tshuva, but it's basically around the 16th century, possibly, in the 1500s. And he records that he received a question from this very distant land called Brazil, and it's very interesting to see how he goes on to describe this unusual phenomena. That's it's south and summer, winter. He's like, it's a fascinating phenomena that. I remember, for many people, when you go to the south of the equator, the first thing you want to do is you have to flush the toilet and see the wind coming around the other way. Yeah? So,
look at this.
Why was he so amazed that the southern hemisphere, the seasons are reversed?
I don't know if he was amazed. He's
Like
just
basic
describing it in this
Oh.
very. I mean, I don't know how much communication. In fact, one thing which I pointed out. Another thing. Let's review the Rambam a minute because we're going to have to get back into the Rambam today also. And I think this Rambam is absolutely fascinating, and it surprises me that historians and scholars haven't made a bigger deal about this Rambam. The Rambam, in his commentary to the Mishnah, which we mentioned last week, says that places where things are reversed, that the rainy season starts in Nisan and the summer season starts in Cheshvan, and it would be detrimental for them to have rain in that season, should do it right. He's clearly describing the southern hemisphere, there were no Jews living in the southern hemisphere in the time of the Rambam. Why is the Rambam, and not just Jews, historically, was there even any communication between people living?
Merchant, right? Though I mean, and so they
Interesting.
Jews traveling.
So there must have already been travel and communication between people in the northern and southern hemisphere. Meaning the Rambam living in Egypt this wasn't like he may not have known. Maybe his brother had traveled that far. Who knows? And his brother had come to ask him what to do. Who knows? Interesting idea.
What year is this, basically?
The Teres Chaim is in the late 1500s. So here he starts off by saying, okay, so there's a community in Brazil. What are they supposed to do? So he starts off, okay, this is a difficult thing, I don't really have time, but this is an important question. He quotes all the sources that we know, the Rosh, the whole story, he goes through all of that. And he brings the Rosh's understanding of the Rambam. Remember, we asked last week that there was a contradiction in the Rambam where his commentary to the Mishnah says you always do according to the local season, and his commentary and in his Mishnah Torah he says that if you're in a place where you need rain in the summer, you should ask for rain in Shemei Tefillah. Anyway, the bottom line of the Teres Chaim is, this is what you're supposed to do in the southern hemisphere. You're supposed to, in the winter months, which for them it's the summer, so what we call winter and they call summer, they should not be requesting for rain, because rain in Brazil, so he's told, is detrimental during those months. It could cause disease and all sorts of stuff. So you should definitely not be requesting for rain at that time. In the summer months, which for you is the winter months, let me clarify this at the outset, because we're going to be going winter, summer, summer, winter. Let's just define our terminology for the purposes of this class. I'm going to say winter, summer by our definition here in the northern hemisphere, and match it accordingly. So, what the Teres Chaim is telling the people of Brazil, and by the way, a very curious thing in the middle here, which I saw Rabbi Vosna also picks up on this, and I don't understand why he's saying this. He says, you're in Brazil, you're just a small community, so you're like individuals, not like a whole community, which we saw that distinction in the Rosh. That's what the Teres Chaim says, which is strange, because obviously they're just a small community, but it's about the needs of the Brazil, not the needs of those 10 people in the minyan. But be that as it may, his bottom line is that in the winter months, because in the winter rain would be detrimental for you, don't ask for rain. In the summer, when you need rain, but still it's not appropriate to change the text of the 9th blessing, what you should do is request for rain in Shemei Tefillah. That is the ruling of the Teres Chaim. Now, it would seem reasonable to guess. Again, it's difficult to get exact clarity of the history. Yeah.
Let me just one thing. So is he paskening that when you get to the part of your davening that you should be davening for rain, you're saying one thing, and then when you're getting to Shemei Tefillah, you're saying something different?
Okay, so you asked a similar question last week, and therefore I want to clarify something. If you'll notice that I never say you say V'sein Talamater in the winter and V'sein Bracha in the summer. I keep on saying you say V'sein Talamater in the winter and you don't say it in the summer. There is no takana of saying V'sein Bracha. There's a takana of a time that you are required to ask for rain, and there's a time when you're required to not ask for rain.
Right.
That's the definition we need. In fact, in some versions of the prayer, in our version and in most Ashkenaz versions, it's the same text of the prayer. The question is, do you add in the words for rain or do you omit those words? There are other communities, mainly Sfardim and some Chassidim also, who have a whole different text for the bracha. The Rambam mentions it, if I recall correctly, have a whole different text for the bracha in the summer. It's not just the same Baruch Aleinu missing the words for rain. It's a different text of a bracha, asking for good seasons and good too, and whatever, So, that's the criteria over here. The criteria is, are you asking for rain or are you not asking for rain? The exact language that you use is not really relevant halachically, right? Okay. So he's telling them the bracha requesting rain. You're not allowed to say that in the summer. Like those who disagreed with the Rosh, you don't do that in the summer. You need rain, so you ask for rain in Shemei Tefillah, in the bracha for your personal needs. In the winter, when there's a takana of Chazal to request for rain, but you can't fulfill that takana because rain for you is detrimental in those months. And so bottom line, he says you should never ask for rain ever in the 9th bracha, half of the year because it's detrimental to you, the other half of the year because it would violate the takana of Chazal. But you should request for rain when you need it in Shemei Tefillah. Now, I don't have exact clarity on the history of the development of all the different Jewish communities in the southern hemisphere. But I think that obviously it was a slow process over many centuries. I think that it's reasonable to assume that many of them followed this ruling. There isn't really any more halachic literature about this question other than the Torah's Chaim for a number of centuries afterwards. The Torah's Chaim is quoted by the Eshel of Rabbi, I believe, it's quoted by the Pasuk on Shulchan Aruch. You could see that in the commentaries on Shulchan Aruch. It seems to me that this was kind of standard procedure for communities in the southern hemisphere. The Jewish community in Australia was, perhaps still is, but certainly was, very strongly associated, as part of the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, and so they were very strongly associated with the chief rabbinate of Britain, of Great Britain. And the custom in Australia, from what it seems to me the dawn of the Jewish community in Australia, all the way through the late 1800s, the 1890s specifically, was to do exactly in accordance with this. They never requested rain in the 9th bracha of the Amidah. Now, then, and this was done based on the ruling of the British chief rabbi, Rabbi Nosson Adler at the time, who he gave that ruling. And I have here a publication from the London Bezdin many years later, actually compiled by the Dayan Rapoport, who, to the best of my knowledge, is not related to me. And he basically says that the approach of the Shulchan Aruch that we follow, that the whole world does like Bavel, even though the times don't match up, sort of not the Rosh. The Rosh wanted to make something sort of more personalized, right? And we don't follow that. He says, what our approach is based on is that we're understanding that Chazal made 2 seasons. Chazal didn't say, ask for rain when you need it. Chazal made specific dates. Dates that you request for rain, dates that you don't request for rain. And that's how we're paskening. But we have this sort of allowance over here that in a time when rain is detrimental for you, you shouldn't ask for it. And that's how he follows, that's how the London Dayan and Paskin, and this psak was accepted by all the Jewish communities in Australia, which at the time, there was a number of shul, but basically you're talking about Melbourne and Sydney. Today there's also a Jewish community in Perth. I don't believe that was the case back then. And that's what they did. Now, then...
What about South Africa? Johannesburg.
So I don't know specifically the history of South Africa. I know what South Africa do now. We'll get to that, but I don't know the history of the. And I actually personally didn't see any tshuvas addressing specifically. I've seen tshuvas about Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Australia. That's what I've seen.
So there's a time of the year where you're supposed to daven for rain that Chazal have instituted, but that time period, because it's detrimental, that window is going to get smaller.
Right.
You have less time that you're going to be actually.
There's going to be no time in the southern hemisphere.
None in the 7th. Oh, because it's always detrimental during that season for that.
That's what we're understanding. Summer, winter, it's flipped backwards. So okay.
Yeah.
Now,
So
not just that.
they never daven for rain.
Right, and they may be doing Shemei Tefillah, but not in the same bracha, not in the bracha that's designated for that. He writes in the Shuvah of Teres Chaim, he says that if it rains in those months, it's going to cause disease and whatever. Okay, fine. Now, so what happens is in the 1890s, I believe it's 1892, there was a rabbi who moved to Australia. He ended up only being there for a short time, for a few years. His name was Rabbi Avraham Aver Hershowitz. And he was very disturbed by what he found in Australia, that we're following the Shuvah of the Teres Chaim. And he wanted to make this change, that Australia should do the same as, quote, the rest of the world, meaning the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere should all be the same, outside of Israel, where there's a difference between whether you start on the 7th of Cheshvan or on December 5th. But besides that, the rest of the world, Europe, United States, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, should all be exactly the same. And part of his argument was that, based on conversations which he had conducted with quote-unquote experts at the time in Australia, was that Australia is different than the rest of the world in that, and arguably even different than the rest of the southern hemisphere, in that rain is always good. There's never a time that we don't want rain. Rain is always good. And so he starts about sending letters to leading halachic authorities at the time, most notably the chief rabbi of Kovna, which is the basically capital of Lithuanian yeshiva world. Slobodka is a suburb of Kovna, right? So he sends to what's the name again? Not Reb Chaim Ozer, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan of Kovna. I was actually personally spent the Pesach in Kovna, and I davened in the shul where Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan was the Rav.
That was the city that had an Eruv, right? It was one of those big cities that had an Eruv. I think historically.
That's from my father's mother's from Kobe.
Your father's mother's from Kovna. Wow, yeah, what?
Yeah, my grandmother, my mother's family.
We're sitting here with a bunch of Litvaks. So,
So you were actually in this place?
I was in the shul. It's a huge shul, and the room which is the big shul, they don't use it because it's too expensive to heat and everything. So they use this tiny little room on the side, and that big room stays locked. But they did, after davening, take us to give it. They showed us the building. And we got to see the big room, and there's a picture there of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan with some other leaders. Whatever. Anyway, so most
YU was named after him, right? That's
right.
The yeshiva of Yitzchak
Yeah,
Elchanan.
exactly. Very good.
Right.
So Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector was one of the most notable poskim who he sent to, as well as Rabbi Shmuel Salant, who was the Rav of Yerushalayim at the time. And both of them were persuaded by his arguments, and they gave the ruling that indeed Australia rain is always good for them, and so they ought to switch and to do like the rest of the world. And basically what happened was, because of the influence, even though he was only there for a short while, but because of the influence of Rabbi Hershowitz, the minhag in Australia changed from doing what the chief rabbinate of London had paskened for them to Rabbi Hershowitz's opinion. And even more surprising is that the minhag of the rest of the southern hemisphere slowly but surely also changed, so that nowadays, for the most part, there are some exceptions, perhaps some small exceptions, but for the most part, any shul that you go to in the southern hemisphere, be it South Africa, like you mentioned, Mark, Argentina, Brazil, all these places, they're all going to be saying V'sein Talamota and V'sein Bracha Mashav Ruach the same way that we do here in the northern hemisphere. And it's interesting that even though arguably you could say that Rabbi Hershowitz's argument doesn't apply to all those places, it only applies to Australia, where supposedly there's some anomaly where rain is always good, nevertheless that minhag sort of spread by far and wide in the southern hemisphere. And I think that there could be a number of reasons for it, be they halachic or just
Build a target around the arrow.
Yeah, exactly. But also
Find other reasons.
Besides the people's wish for simplicity and uniformity and all that stuff, I think there's some level where this can be, like we saw from the Tshuvas of London, where you can kind of sort of attribute this ruling to the Shulchan Aruch, where at the end of the day the Shulchan Aruch says we don't follow the Rosh, we don't do separate seasons for different places, everybody follows Bavel. So fine, everybody follows Bavel. And it's only in the, if it's mamish detrimental, but most places it's not detrimental, it's okay, it's all good, and so that became the minhag. Now, there are some differences of opinion, even till today, this you could get carried away with, we're not going to get into all the details over here, about what to do if you made a mistake. Meaning, if you're standing in Australia in July, and you forget to say V'sein Talamotar, and you did say V'sein Talamotar, or you're standing in December and you forgot to say V'sein Talamotar, do you repeat the Amidah? Basically, no, but that's already a little bit tedious to go through all the details and all the different opinions about that. Now, you gotta speak up.
Is that true that rain is always wanted in the weather? Is that what the meteorologist or whoever it is, the farmers would say?
Ein lanu elo dalad amas shel halacha, as is the name of our podcast. We don't need to listen to me. No, I'm just kidding. You'll have to. We're going to get to that. Okay. So,
What is Wikipedia?
one lone voice in this whole battle. I'm sorry. Is that of Rabbi Shmuel Vosner. I'm sorry. Before we get to Rabbi Vosner, let's go to some other things here. So. This is an important shuvah, which does not have a date to it, and one of the reasons why it's important is because it's from a prominent person who himself lived in Australia, and he starts off his shuvah. He says, "You're asking me what to do." He says, "I don't understand what you're asking. You yourself know from all the years that I was in Melbourne that we did it the same as the rest of the world. Why are you asking me this as if you've just discovered America or Australia?" He basically goes through an overview of the sugya. He says, it appears to me certain to say that Chazal just instituted specific times, and you have to fill in your country to one of those times. And he says, if you recall, the Rosh in his tshuva, he described that when he was traveling through the south of France in Montpellier, he says they started saying it a little bit early. Instead of starting on December, they started at Zayin Cheshvan, which is the same as Israel, but they didn't continue saying it past Pesach. And Rabbi Stern in the B'Tzelach Chochmah suggests that the reason for that opinion was you only have those zones to fit into. You must finish by Pesach. Chazal never gave an allowance to request rain after Pesach. When you start rain there, you have two options. You could either go with the Bavel date, which is 60 days into the past the equinox, or you could go with the Israel date of Zayin Cheshvan, whichever one of those two dates is more appropriate to your season. But other than that, Russia's words were not accepted, and Australia should do the same as the Northern Hemisphere. And then he goes back on to quote the Teres Chaim, and he says, however, it's important to point out, Akiva, that the situation in Australia is different than the situation in Brazil. Because in Brazil, the Teres Chaim wrote that if you have rain in the summer, it's going to cause sickness. In Australia, rain is always wanted. We always want rain over there. So therefore, whatever the Teres Chaim wrote about Brazil doesn't apply to Australia. The irony of it is that nowadays the community in Brazil have reverted to doing what Australia are doing for the most part. Somebody who's on the forefront of the counter-argument is Rabbi Vosner. Rabbi Shmuel Vosner, who was a very prominent posek, who lived in Bnei Brak, passed away in the last decade, I would say. And he has a letter dated Tes Kislev Tovshin Chafalev, so that's December 1960, addressed to Rabbi Leitner, who is the Rav of the Adas Yiraim community in Montevideo, Uruguay. And he says, you're asking me that the way you word your question is that certainly that in the summer, meaning between Pesach and Sukkot, when we need rain, then we're not supposed to be asking for rain. At the very most, we should do so in Shemei Tefillah. The question is, what should we do in the winter where we don't need rain because we're in the southern hemisphere, but the rest of the world is asking for rain? Says Rabbi Vosner, he says, what you're taking for granted, I don't accept the premise at all. And Rabbi Vosner basically says that that you guys are all missing a very important point over here. You're all bringing the precedent of the case of the Rosh and the case of Nineveh. Remember we had in the Gemara that the people of Nineveh, Eliyahu, I think you read that Gemara, the people of Nineveh sent the question, what should they do? He says, none of these places and none of these precedents can be compared to Australia or to Montevideo. Because, he says, over there, they needed rain in the same season that Bavel, that Iraq and Eretz Yisrael need rain. But they also needed rain a little bit longer or a little bit earlier. So there we're saying, look, for the most part, you're in the same seasons as Israel, so just stick the dates there. But here you're describing a complete new reality where the seasons are flipped. That you don't need rain when everybody else does need rain, and you do need rain when everybody else wants no rain. You can't compare that to the case of the Rosh. This is a whole new reality. And he says something fascinating, which I'm surprised nobody else. Remember last week we discussed that there's a stira in the Rambam, that there may be a stira in the Rambam, that the Rambam's commentary, the Mishnah says, you do whatever your needs are, and in the Mishnah Torah he says that you could only ask for rain at a different time in Shemei Tefillah. He says it's very simple. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah is paraphrasing the Gemara. The Gemara is saying, the Gemara says the story that the people on Nineveh asked Rabbi what to do when they need rain. And what was the wording of their question? They said, we need rain afilu. We need rain even in Tammuz. In other words, we need rain in the winter like everybody else. Where, whatever the climate, the mountains, the valleys, whatever it is, we specifically need rain also in Tammuz. Says Rabbi, no. You're Yechidim. You're not changing Sidrei Bereshis. You're not going to change everything around because you need rain also in Tammuz. You need rain in Tammuz, ask for rain in Shemei Tefillah. The Rambam in Mishnah Torah specifically says that it's a time where they don't need rain between Sukkot and Pesach, and they do need rain between Pesach and Sukkot. There he's talking about the southern hemisphere. And that's where he says that you go exactly according to the local needs.
Yeah.
Says the Rambam is explicitly addressing the southern hemisphere, and he says 100% like the inverse of what you do with the northern hemisphere.
Makes more sense.
That answers the steer?
Of course it answers the stira. His diuk is quite strong in the Rambam, I believe.
Yeah.
He says the Rambam Mishnah Torah doesn't say new halachas. The Rambam Mishnah Torah is based on the Gemara. The Rambam Mishnah Torah says Yemois HaChama. It's clear that he's describing like his scenario of Nineveh.
Yeah. Where is Nineveh?
So we mentioned
it's in the southern hemisphere.
No, Nineveh is in the northern hemisphere. It's we mentioned last week. It's unclear exactly. It's unclear what Nineveh in that Gemara specifically means, but it's not the northern. It's the northern hemisphere.
But that Rambam was there. It's just a little bit when he's describing that. Put it in Shemei Tefillah. That's something that you're pretty much like everyone else. You just have a little bit of a difference. And then another Rambam, the Rambam says to do something totally different. That sounds like a stira. And the answer that he's giving is that the Rambam, where he says to completely do something different than everyone else, is it's a completely different situation, as opposed to Nineveh. Okay.
Now, an important line over here, by the way, is that he says that you, in your question, in your letter to me, you quote this Torah Chaim, which we started with today, and Rabbi Rosen says, I don't have the Torah Chaim, I don't have a copy of it at hand, which that's going to be relevant, because later Tshuvas, who refer back to this Tshuva, they say that had Rabbi Rosen seen what the Torah Chaim actually says, he may not have come out so forceful as he did. But he says, this that you're saying that to do this would be, he says, I'm not creating two different laws for the northern and southern hemisphere. The contrary, there is nothing more strange than to lie, to lie in your prayer. How could you stand in front of God and say, give me rain when it's bad for you to have rain, and not say give me rain when you need it? Nineveh is a different story. Nineveh they're on the same track as everybody else. They need rain when everybody else needs it. They also need rain at another time, so they could request it in Shemei Tefillah. But to start saying that you're in a place where it's completely the inverse and you should just be following like blind ducks, that doesn't make any sense. All right. Lamaisa, the important thing over here is, and you'll see soon how this changes with his son, who's continuing his father's campaign. But he says, Lamaisa, this that I'm telling you this that I'm telling you not to request rain in the winter months, that 100% I'm totally on board with that. This that I'm telling you that you should request rain in the 9th bracha in the summer months, I think I'm 100% right, but I don't want to tell you to do that in practice until another until somebody who will till some well-known rabbi Pesach will agree with me, even though it seems totally obvious and clear to me. Now, again, like we said, this tshuva is penned in December of 1960. I think the best way to go forward is I think there's something nice about going in chronological order. Obviously, we're not going to read everything that was ever published on this topic, but again, it's like an overview. So, in the summer of 1982, the Rebbe made a comment at a Farbrengen. Parenthetically, it wasn't the thing, and the Rebbe sort of just made a comment. Again, I forget the exact context. Something along the lines of like, that in the southern hemisphere where things are reversed, so that they say the same Talmud and the same bracha also reversed. So as you can imagine, Chassidim hear this and they're like, oh, okay, I guess we better be changing, and we're gonna, we're living in Australia. We've been doing all these years what Rabbi Hershowitz told us to do, but the Rebbe is clearly disagreeing with Rabbi Hershowitz, and so we got to make a change. And as your antennas might be able to tell you, the Rebbe was not also happy about this. And the Rebbe responded to them, absolutely not. Something along the lines of, obviously Yisrael is much more important than that, and already you see from the Rosh, and don't make differences between everybody else, and, what?
So why did he say it then?
Because he wasn't paskening what to do halacha. He was just mentioning what would make sense to do from.
So one is svara and one is halacha l'maisa. No, there's all these other factors to take into account.
Yeah. Anyway, so then the following Shabbos, the Rebbe spoke about this at length, and the Rebbe asked the team. Actually, tomorrow we're going to have a class from Rabbi Zalmanov discussing a little bit the history of the publication of the Rebbe's talk, so maybe he'll touch on this. But anyway, but the Rebbe asked the team to sort of prepare a little bit of an overview of the bibliography, so to speak, of the material on this topic heretofore. Anyway, in that talk, the Rebbe mentioned the idea that the Rosh himself, in fact, said said not that in practice better to do what everybody else is doing than to do what makes sense. So the Rebbe said, based on that Rosh alone, we shouldn't change what we're doing in the southern hemisphere. An interesting thing is that part of the terminology you see in many of these shuvas is Rov Ha'elam. Most of the world is doing X, and obviously, scientifically, that's not the case. Most of the world, the 50% of the world is the northern hemisphere, and 50% is the southern hemisphere. But what they mean by most of the world is, well, most of the Jewish, right? But then, what would happen in the theoretical situation where there's no Jews left, or a few Jews left, when there's more Jews in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere? We're going to change everything? So I saw in this Sikha, the Rebbe says something where most of the world doesn't need it, and then he says most of the world not in quantity, but in quality, meaning Israel. Which, Bill, that touches a little bit on the point that you've mentioned a couple of times in this discussion, that are we talking about the local needs or are we talking about Israel, which Rabbi Vosner's the second Shuvah is going to get more into that. Additionally, the Rebbe in that talk mentioned the idea of how do you in general approach a halacha where we have a ruling of a certain posek, of certain poskim who didn't see other poskim, and so Lamaisa, he says the most recent rulings based on Rabbi Avram Ever Hershowitz's campaign is that they should do the same as everybody else, and therefore leave it. And then you see over here there's an overview of all the different which the team put together. They bring the Shut Teres Chaim from Salonika, Rab Chaim Shabsi. They bring the chief rabbi of London. They bring Hershowitz. They bring Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan of Kovner, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. They bring the Hartzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the Rav in Yerushalayim, Mishpatei Oziel, who was the Sfadi Rav in Eretz Yisrael, etc. And again, the consensus of most of the poskim seems to be that pretty much, with small variations, pretty much in Australia to do the same as everybody else. One moment. And here we come to the very, very lengthy tshuva, which is published in the later volumes of Rabbi Vosner's tshuvas, but it's not written by him, it's written by his son, Rabbi Ben Zion Yaakov Halevi Vosner, who himself spent a few years living in Australia, and he is absolutely appalled by all of this, and he has a very lengthy tshuva, and I'm going to go through now some highlights of his tshuva with the counter-arguments, yes. Essentially, Rabbi Vosner Jr., again, if I didn't mention, this tshuva is penned on Rosh Chodesh Iyar Tavshin Vav, so that's in May 1996. He basically takes the same position of his father, but much stronger than his father. And if you recall, his father said at the end of his tshuva that I'm not going to rule this in practice until I have another goyin before him to agree with me. He has no hesitations. He's going full force. So listen to this. And he says, the truth is that when I lived there, this is what I personally did. That I said. I did the request for rain based on the local needs of Australia, but I was not successful at changing the public custom because they've already been doing what the rest of the world does, even though nobody understood why they were doing that way and on what basis they were doing it and who they were relying on. But everybody was just doing it, and it wasn't possible to change. And he says, overviewing the relevant literature, you could see that there are 8 arguments made in favor of changing of Australia doing the same as the southern hemisphere, doing the same as the northern hemisphere. And one by one, I'm going to address these 8 arguments. What are the 8 arguments? Number one, that rain in Australia, rain was never bad. Even if they have rain throughout all the winter months, which by them is the summer, it won't be bad. Number 2, we see the Rosh himself refrained from changing what they would do in his place, even though he believed that to be the correct thing, but he preferred to do what everybody else does. Number 3, Chazal only give us 2 seasons. They don't give us an option of making different numbers. Number 4, that, Bill, you'll like this one. Number 4, that anyway in Australia they're supposed to be asking for rain for what the needs of Eretz Yisrael are, not what the needs of Australia are. Number 5, he says, even lands where they don't have rain at all should still do like Eretz Yisrael. I'm not sure what that means. Number 6, there's a concern of loisus goydudu, not to be doing differently than everybody else. Number 7, there's already an established custom, so who are you to come along in the 20th century and try to change things? And number 8, finally, he says the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say anything about Australia, so we could assume from the silence of the Shulchan Aruch that it means that Australia and Europe are the same. And now, says Rabbi Vosner, we're into the 9th inning. Okay. He says, first of all, he says the Rambam. He says you're starting off by saying that rain is never bad in Australia. He says, first of all, I have a bigger problem. He says, go to anywhere in the world, go to Europe, go to America, wherever you want. It always rains sometimes in the summer. And not only does it not cause damage, speak to the farmers. They love it when it rains in July. It's good for them. Get some moist, get something. Everything, all the produce being dried out, that's never a good thing. Rain is always, as if somehow Australia is unique. Everywhere in the world it's good for them. How could the Rambam write that these places, if they have rain in those months, it's going to cause death and destruction? What is he talking about? Says Rabbi Vosner, and here's, I think it's important to this distinction that we mentioned before, that it's not about do you say the same Talamata or do you say the same bracha. It's about, are you requesting rain or are you not requesting rain? Or, like I mentioned, the Sfaradim have a complete different text of the bracha. It's not about rain or not rain. It's about seasons. Yes, it's manifest in the word rain, but the word rain means clouds. The word rain means it's winter, there's less hours of sunlight. The word rain is code for everything that these winter months bring with them. And the word summer is code for everything that those bring with them. So of course that's true to say, yes, there's no place in the world virtually, or certainly not most places that we know of, that some rain in June and July or May is going to be problematic. But if May, June, July, August would be winter with short daylight hours and cloud and lower temperatures, that would be catastrophic. That's what it means. He says, Ad K'dei Kach, the Gemara says that the Gemara says that if rain comes after Nisan, it's a siman klala, it's a curse, it's a terrible thing. He says, what do you mean? Most places in the world it rains after Nisan, but rather it means, and he brings the Rishonim already say this, that what they mean by that is that if it didn't rain all the months until then, and it only starts raining in Nisan, then it's going to be a siman klala. But if you had a healthy winter and then then it starts raining in Nisan, then what's it going to do? And therefore, he says this whole idea that Australia is different than everywhere else doesn't make any sense.
Different in what sense?
That they always need rain.
Oh.
No, there's no place that always needs rain. Or that rain is not. Sorry, that rain. I'm sorry. That rain. Australia. I'm sorry. We got to that soon. You're saying that Australia is different than everybody else. That rain is not bad for them in the winter, in the summer.
That's really
in
true.
their summer. That's true of every place. It's not about whether a little bit of a raindrop is going to be a problem. Okay. He says. Then your second argument is that you see the Rosh himself refrained from changing his minhag, even though he believed that was the correct thing to do. He says this is such a stupid thing. I don't even see the need to respond to it. The whole point of the Rosh was that he was trying to innovate something, to do something that goes against the established custom and to go against the symbol of the Gemara. So there was a counter-argument, and like the Rosh himself quotes the counter-argument to say, look, it's rare that there should be droughts in Europe, and not only is it rare that there should be droughts, often the rain, the produce gets ruined because there's too much rain in the summer, right? If there's too much rain, then that's going to be a problem, right? So therefore we shouldn't change anything because one year it happens to be whatever, fine. But that's not the case in Australia. The Rosh is not talking about Australia where the seasons are completely flipped. Okay, then he says that there's only 2 times in Chazal. He says, no, we've already established that that's not the case. Then he says, you're saying that we should talk about Eretz Yisrael. What are you talking about? Find any place in Chazal or in Shas where it says that you're asking for the needs of the climate in Eretz Yisrael? Absolutely not. Would you say that if there's a drought in Eretz Yisrael and they're fasting in Eretz Yisrael in those dates, that the rest of the world should also fast? It doesn't know. The fasts are clearly only for the local, for the locale that needs the rain. And he says, if you're going to say that, then maybe you should also start Shabbos when the time zone of Israel. And, he says that this is reductio ad absurdum, right? Okay. Then he says, you're telling me that I shouldn't come to Australia now in the 1990s and change an existing custom? He says, besides the question of when you can or cannot change an existing custom is complicated, and he brings a whole bunch of references, etc. But he goes on to say, he says, on the contrary, I'm the one who's restoring the original custom, which was done based on the Teres Chaim and others, that they don't request rain in these months. And you, and in the 1890, Rabbi Hershowitz, you're coming along. You're the one who's making the change, and I'm just undoing you did the illegitimate change, and I'm undoing your illegitimate change. He says, you're telling me that Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that there should be any difference? Shulchan Aruch is not talking about places in Australia. You can't say that because it wasn't relevant, there was nobody living there. You can't say that because Shulchan Aruch is silent in the matter, therefore it means that they should do the same as the Northern Hemisphere. And on the contrary, the only one of the earlier sources of the Rishonim who talks specifically about such a scenario is the Rambam in his commentary to the Mishnah, and he says precisely to do the exact opposite of what they're doing in the Northern Hemisphere.
There's the Brazil case, right? That goes way back.
Well, that's not as far back as the Rambam, but he's not really saying so much different than the Brazil case, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, then he says, here's where he gets juicy. He says, before I finish this letter of mine, he says, I want to tell you like this, that I'm not really coming to argue with all these tremendous Gedolei HaPoskim who, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, Rabbi Pesach Frank, etc., but really, my real taina, my real complaint is on the person who presented them with the facts. Now, I don't think he mentions his name over here, but he's obviously talking about Rabbi Hershowitz. And he says, Rabbi Hershowitz, he says, I'll read to you a few lines inside. Tamtis Adava, summary of the thing is, that these poskim were painted an unclear picture. As if the climate in Australia and similar places is unique and different than the rest of the world. They presented it to them as if there isn't really any noticeable difference between the seasons. And they told them that rain comes all year round. All of this is distant from the truth and opposite to reality, contradictory to reality. The days of the summer and the winter in Australia are different from each other. clearly as they are in the rest of the world. And anybody who says differently is only fooling himself and others. I lived in Australia for 6 years. I visited them many times. I can testify. My own eyes saw that the summer and winter over there are summer and winter different from each other like any other place, and how can anybody possibly deny this? So basically what he's saying over here is that probably unwittingly Rabbi Avram Aver Hershowitz, he got letters from Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan and from Rabbi Shmuel Salant and all these others to tell paskening that Australia should do what the rest of the world does, based on the erroneous description as if Australia doesn't really have a summer and a winter, and rain is always good. There's never a time when rain is bad, and there isn't really any difference between summer and winter. And so we might as well, why should we be doing different than everybody else? Let's do the same as, quote, the rest of the world. But he says, I don't know why Rabbi Hershowitz said that, why he thought that, what his other agendas are, whether this is conscious or subconscious. But the bottom line is that this is not the case, and therefore, says Rabbi, kind of exact opposite of what the Rebbe said in a way. Yeah, the Rebbe was saying, look, all these people wrote, so let's accept what they said. Rabbi Voss is saying all of these people wrote they were presented with the inaccurate facts, right? And so he says, and the Tavna Ladina, my summary, Paskening Lamaisa, is that you do exact opposite. You do say V'sein Talamatar in the 9th bracha of the Amidah, in the months between Pesach and Sukkot. You don't say it the other way around. Absolute, with no hesitation. It goes on. And he says, you're going to come and tell me that you're hesitant to make changes in the prayer. Well, then he says, why get into this? Don't go and live in the southern hemisphere. If you're not comfortable to do the right thing, stay in the northern hemisphere. And he says, all the poskim agree that you should not ask for rain. Yeah, all the poskim, you include in all the poskim, except in Shemei Tefillah. He said, this is where he differs from the Teres Chaim. The Teres Chaim, way back, he says you should do so in Shemei Tefillah. He says, okay, the Teres Chaim, you see in his Tshuva, he writes that he doesn't even consider them a community, he considers them as individuals. So go in Shemei Tefillah. But now that there's all these communities in the southern hemisphere, to start making a Seder, the whole idea of Shemei Tefillah is that this is a personalized thing that you personally need. But to start saying that thousands of Jews in the southern hemisphere should for all eternity be saying something that belongs to the 9th blessing as part of the community, to switch it to say it in the Shemei Tefillah personal blessing and to omit it from the repetition of the Amidah and all of those things, it says, this is very, very strange, and therefore he doesn't want to. Therefore, that's his bottom line. But like he says himself, he wasn't successful. And the fact is that if you go today, most people who are learned will basically, if you go to anybody who lives in those communities, just go up to a random guy in shul, and it depends. If he's just a random guy who hasn't sort of learned the sugya, and you'll ask him, "What do you do over here?" He'll look at you like, "What do you mean?" Like, it'll never even occur to him that it was a question. Like, what do you mean? Like, at the 5th of December, you start saying Talamat, right? But if you go to anybody who's more learned, most likely what they'll tell you is, we do like the northern hemisphere. It doesn't make any sense, but we've tried numerous times to change it and it's never worked, and so we're going to take the line of the Rosh that we do what doesn't make sense to preserve harmony, and that's the end of that. An interesting, there's one more important tshuva here from Minchas Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, written in Tammuz of Tashon Lamed Hey, 1975, to the Rav in Buenos Aires, where there was a Sephardi community where they wanted to change, and he's telling them not to change, and he says, he's basically telling them to do similar to what the Teres Chaim said to do, and he says even Rav Vosner would have agreed to it had he had the Teres Chaim in access to it, and he would have seen all the details over there. Okay, that's just one more final thought to finish off with, is that a big part of the discussion, which we didn't get into the details of today, is this is all about when to request for rain. What about when do you mention rain? So, as you can imagine, there's a lot of technical and back and forth about that. But one interesting idea that the Pasuk mentioned that as far as that is concerned, you could do something in the southern hemisphere that will always be okay, and that is to always say Merit Atol. Because whenever you say Merit Atol, it's okay. If you mention dew instead of rain, not requesting, but if you mention dew instead of rain, that's good enough. So you could mention it in the summer, you could mention it in the winter, you could mention it, and in whatever your definition of winter and summer is, it doesn't make a difference. You could just always say Merit Atol. So some poskim like that, other poskim say no, because that's, if you said Merit Atol in the summer, in the winter, then that's good enough. But we don't want to make a seder that that's what you're supposed to do in the winter. Okay, but then which one is the winter and which is the summer? So you can go round and round in circles.
How does Maria Tal help you with anything?
Because that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, that the halacha is that if you said Merit Atol at a time that you were supposed to say Mashav Aruch Merit Geshem, then you don't need to repeat the Amidah. Right? So the Ashkenazim who don't say Merit Atol in the summer, so if they forget to say Mashav Aruch Merit Geshem in the winter, they have to repeat it. But Sfardim who say Merit Atol in the summer, and Chassidim, we don't have to repeat the Amidah if you forget to say Mashav Aruch, because if you forgot to say Mashav Aruch, chances are you said Merit Atol, which B'diavad is good enough.
So I understand that technically, but why would that be? I mean, isn't rain the thing that you're supposed to be?
So because
Tal comes all year. Right?
Yeah, no, because dew and rain are similar enough in the sense that they both bring chayas and rejuvenation. So it's similar enough that it's
Hashem for something that
it's
does something similar to rain.
Yeah, so it's similar enough that we're not going to make you repeat the Amidah, basically. That's discussed at length in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Yudalad. We mentioned it 2 weeks ago.
I say Maria Tal. I didn't know I'm.
Yeah, we've already discussed. You're a confused Jew.
Very confused. Very confused.
So when we're davening for rain, back to this Eretz Yisrael and Babel. And
By the way, just 1 second, Bill. I think the bottom line is that we should all avoid the southern hemisphere, like Rabbi was saying.
Don't go there.
I mean, in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
There's dateline
For
problems
rain,
too there.
Can we be davening with the thought that we are looking for rain in Eretz Yisrael as well as Chicago, because we're in the northern hemisphere?
Oh, absolutely. I
So
mean,
that's what we're
yes.
doing.
I mean,
Bubble, whatever.
if you just for your well-being, I wouldn't tell Rabbi Vosner that you did that. But other than him, I think you were. Yeah, no, I don't see. There's no problem with that. Mark, you wanted to say something?
I probably repeated this before on one of my visits in July. It was Shabbos morning. I was leaving the shul.